CIA officers Sia and Max enter Russia under commercial cover to recruit Vladimir Putin's money man. Sia works for a London law firm that conceals the wealth of the super rich. Max's family business in Mexico, a CIA front since 1960s, is a farm that breeds high-end racehorses. They pose as a couple to target Vladimir Putin's private banker and his wife Anna, who, unbeknownst to the CIA, is a Russian intelligence officer deep undercover at the bank. As they descend further into a Russian world dripping with luxury and rife with gangland violence, Sia and Max's only hope may be Anna, who's playing a game of her own. Careening between the horse ranch in North Mexico, the corridors of Langley, and the dark opulence of Putin's Russia, Moscow X, written by David McClosky, is both a gripping thriller of modern espionage and a raw, unsparing commentary on the nature of truth, loyalty, and vengeance. In this episode of Shots from the Winchester Podcast, our very own Dell Roll interviews David McClosky on his new book, Moscow X and Damascus Station. Stay tuned.
Hello there, and welcome to another episode of Shots from the Winchester Podcast, and we got a treat for you. My name is Dell. I am standing in for the normal crew of Al or John, and here's what we got for you tonight. David McClosky is a former CIA analyst, and he is the New York Times best-selling author of not only Damascus Station, but his latest book, Moscow X, that just dropped last week. David, it is an absolute joy to have you here. And how are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing well, Dell. Thanks for having me. And also thank you for the honorary bestowing of the New York Times bestseller honor onto me. I have not quite accomplished that in terms of numbers, but I will take the honorary mention from a distinguished man such as yourself.
Well, being a retired operations officer, I have been known to just make shit up on the fly. Would not be the first time. Would not be the first time at all.
I'll take it. I'll take whatever I can get, man. But it's great to be with you. I'm excited for this.
It's great to have you here. This is like a huge time for you with the release of Moscow X last week. You've done, how many podcasts have you done in the last couple of weeks?
I don't know, probably around, 10 to 12 or something like that. Ish. Let's call it a dozen. Baker's
That's
dozen,
pretty good.
Like that. Yeah.
That's pretty good.
It's been fun.
That's pretty cool because most people are not interviewed 12 times in a couple of weeks. So you're doing pretty good, my friend. You're doing pretty good indeed. For those who may not be familiar with Damascus Station, tell us a little bit about it and tell us a little bit about your path from working for the agency to becoming a writer.
Yeah. So Damascus Station, my first novel, is really a story about a CIA case officer named Sam and his Syrian asset Miriam, who kind of fall into a forbidden relationship. They break one of the cardinal rules of handling human assets and fall in love. They go into Damascus to hunt down the killer of another CIA officer, and in that process really come face to face with all the tension and the conflict and the passion in their own relationship, as well as into conflict with a fairly brutal pair of Syrian brothers and a very dark secret at the heart of the Syrian regime. So it's a book about, it's a spy novel, so it's a book about espionage and the espionage business. But, I hope it's also a story about kind of love and loyalty and betrayal, and ultimately what it means to be human in the middle of this very inhuman conflict, because it's set in kind of the early years of the Syrian civil war. And, the book really came out of my time working on Syria when I was at CIA.
Mm-hmm.
I joined as an undergrad intern. I was an analyst for about 8 years, working pretty much just on Syria. Lived in Damascus, was watching the place as it started to come apart, and as the war really became very protracted and dark and ugly. And when I left the agency in 2014, I had kind of gotten to a point where I felt like there was something to process there emotionally with how that had gone down. And, because we sort of, we're watching this conflict now in Israel and Palestine, but, it's sort of hard to understand from the relative safety and comfort of, the US or Western Europe, like what it's like when your country goes from, it's a country of 23 million people in Syria. Half the population ended up being displaced or actually fleeing. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed. The UN stopped counting in like 2015 or 2016. Tens of thousands detained, tortured. Poverty rates in Syria now would be 80 to 90%, depending on how you count it. The whole society, the infrastructure has been destroyed. You essentially have a country that's a bunch of fiefdoms run by different warlords. And so looking at that, I was like, man, how do I process and kind of deal with this? And the way I did that was by writing. And so I just kind of started to write when I left. There was no structure to it. There was no plot. Most of it was really awful. But I got to a point where I realized, I really enjoy writing. I enjoy the process of it. It helps me to learn more about myself, to process the world. I get into flow when I write, where 5, 6, 7 hours will just go by, like that. And so I discovered all that in the months after leaving the agency. Took a consulting job, left DC, basically took 5 years where I wasn't writing. And then for a whole bunch of reasons, was able to take 6 months and focus on writing again and not be a consultant, which, was like an 80-hour-a-week thing in many cases. It just wasn't, I couldn't write. I couldn't have like a side hustle, as a McKinsey consultant. So, that 6-month period, like Damascus Station really came out of that, because I think I'd had some time where I could be more objective about the story, be more objective about Syria, but I knew that there was a story there that I could tell, felt like I wanted to tell. And, I just started to kind of write and I thought, look, I'll just try. I'll see what I can do with this. And if I, at the end of it, just have a manuscript that's just for me or for, a small group of friends, like that's great too. But I was pretty committed at that point to try to just get the story done. And that's where the book came from.
No, that's cool. That's cool. Do you think that the discipline of writing from your time as an analyst helped or hindered you when you made this transition to being a writer?
I think there were pieces of it that were helpful, and there were elements of it that I had to sort of consciously shed. So it's helpful to think about precision of language. It's helpful to think about how do I economically tell a story, and not overdo it or use a whole bunch of words, phrases, clauses that are confusing or that just muck up the story, right?
Yeah.
You have to be a pretty effective self-editor, I think, to be a good analyst. And you have to be able to edit other people's work. So you kind of get to a point where I think there's something to say there about the structure of an argument and how you put it down on paper and how you use words to make that argument that's helpful. When you're talking about writing fiction, there's a whole bunch of stuff about, like the CIA, when they're teaching you how to write, it's very anodyne. You're sort of stripping out voice and emotion, and you're certainly not dealing with like character. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And all of that push to be extremely hyperlogical with the way you communicate and to strip your own voice out because you're writing a product that just says CIA on it, not something that says David McClosky. All that stuff I sort of had to consciously understand that was going to hold back anything I wrote. And I had to push it aside. So I think it's complicated. I think I'm glad that I had that experience because I think it did teach me a lot of things as a writer. At the same time, there were things I had to sort of consciously say, look, I'm just going to ignore this and move forward.
No, absolutely. And I I would suspect, because I think this is the case with operations officers, that you develop this discipline of writing. It doesn't matter how tired you are. It doesn't matter what you've got going on. You come back from that activity, whatever it is, and you're going to be writing for the next 72 days or 72 hours. Because your asset may have provided whatever piece of information. If you don't write it down and report it in, it might as well have not happened. So
Right.
there's that discipline. But I think what's maybe different from your experience was there's no, at least on the operational side, there really wasn't any flowery language at all.
Yeah.
Pleasantries were exchanged, and then you get into the meat of what happened. So yeah, but I tell you, this, and you're well aware of it, but for our viewers, this was just so well received. In fact, if I look at General David Petraeus, he made the comment, the best spy novel I have ever read, and that was from the former director of the CIA. That's no small thing. So let me ask you, I know when I read this, I was like, and this is actually, I think I read it before you and I met. I think really what hit me was just the authenticness of it. I was like, this guy knows his stuff. This stuff is spot on. So maybe you could talk to our viewers a little bit about, so how did you make this so authentic? What was your experience? How did you learn about the craft?
Well, I I spent a lot of time talking about life as a case officer with case officers. And I read almost every sort of case officer, former OO memoir that I could get my hands on.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of was able, through some of my former contacts, but then also just new friends that I met along the way, to get a team of folks kind of around me who would be willing to jump on a call if I'm like, hey, I've got this person in this situation. How would you play it? Or what are the factors that are influencing this decision or this operation, to kind of just to immerse myself as much as I could in that world. Because, it's funny, like, I was an analyst, right? So I spent a lot of time with case officers in certain settings, but it wasn't like I was talking about the crap. Like I wasn't really. We were talking about substance around Syria a lot. It wasn't like we were talking a lot about what is it really like to do your job as a case officer,
Yeah.
And so a lot of that stuff I had to acquire that knowledge as I wrote. I actually think I've gotten to know much more about that job since I've left than when I was inside. But it was just it's been that way on every book, where I try to ground most every scene, in some. I try to set it up so if I'm breaking rules, if I'm breaking rules of tradecraft, if I'm breaking rules of policy and procedure, if I'm breaking cultural norms, that at least I'm hopefully aware of it myself.
Yeah.
And there's a plot, there's a reason for story or character purposes why that happens, as opposed to just sort of being me not really understanding, how this would go down. So it's a lot of research, a lot of conversations with folks, and I just sort of am also fascinated by the job and by a lot of the kind of arcane bureaucratic stuff that goes along with it too. So I've tried to make the books in some ways, although stuff blows up and there's action and all that good stuff that you'd expect in a spy thriller. Like, I'm trying to maybe peel back the curtain a little bit on some of the zany side of actually working in a big secretive government bureaucracy.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because if I were to read the first line from his new book, Moscow X, chapter 1, That day, Artemis Aphrodite Proctor would end up in the penalty box. And to those who may not necessarily understand it, that says volumes about where things are about to go. Could you explain to our viewers what is the penalty box in agency parlance?
Yeah, and I will say it's important to note, and I had a fight with my editor about this. Not a bad fight, but he was like, "Why is penalty box capitalized?" And I said, "Well, because it's a place, and in the same way that station is capitalized in my books, and agency is capitalized. There's certain things that just in the vernacular of CIA, like you would always, in my opinion, see this written, it'd be capitalized. And basically, the penalty box is if an agency officer has committed some kind of infraction, personal, professional, or otherwise, and I think this is changing a little bit, but my understanding is that it's typically very hard to fire a CIA case officer. There are certain things that they could do that would lead down that path, but there could be a lot of infractions that at normal businesses would get you fired, but that at CIA necessarily don't. And the penalty box is basically 2 or so years of a stateside at Langley tour or PCS where you're sort of not doing something that's probably extremely critical or important or sensitive, but to let the powers that be become more comfortable with the fact that you could be released back into the wild and maybe given a, posting out on a station at some point in the future or given more responsibility. So you're basically doing a sort of babysit. You babysat at Langley for a couple years until you pass that test, and then you could go. That is my, I mean, and it's funny because I've gotten a number of formers have read different versions of this book, and they all kind of laugh at the use of the penalty box because it's a thing, and everybody knows somebody, and there's some legendary stories of people who have wound up there for doing things that are like, oh man, if you worked at Pepsi Cola and you did that, like you'd be showing the door.
Oh yeah. No. I mean, and that's why I wanted you to explain it, because it's like outside of government, you'd just be gone. You'd be over with. But I mean, when you think about all that goes into training someone and getting them cleared and all this stuff, it's a huge investment. So
Right.
we're inclined to show a little bit of grace and a little bit of recovery, just to keep somebody going. But that's the sort of thing that I love about your books, is they do have that deep authenticity. And even when you do deliberately do things that are not aligned with what we would do, like the personal relationship between Sam and his asset,
Yeah.
I would say that, and I don't know what your motivations were, but it's almost like to really nail down the emotional connection between a handling officer and their asset, and how that depth of intimacy in an emotional level between handler and asset, that it's really hard to explain any other way.
Yeah. Well, and, in that case, I was kind of I was intrigued by how you put romance to the side, and to your point, exactly, it's the best sort of handler asset relationships. There's a lot of trust and intimacy there, right? Full
Yeah.
stop. But then if you add the romantic piece to it, well, then you're starting to deal with, you're cooking with gas there from a character and plot standpoint, because a lot of things can happen that work in the story that certainly wouldn't most likely happen in real life, but that work in the context of the story and make for a really great read.
Mhm.
And so, but this whole question of when do you kind of break the rules of reality and when do you not? I mean, I don't know the right answer other than to say it's just sort of a bit of an art and a balance inside the story to know how do I use certain opportunities to build up some real credibility with readers who will say, even if you haven't been inside the business, you kind of look at it and say, okay, well, this must be real enough, right? And then be willing, when I break the rules later on in
Mhm.
the story, to sort of not even care or notice because you're so drawn in. It's a balancing act. I don't know what the right mixes in every story, but you need some of both, I think, to really have fun in a spy thriller.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Maybe you could spend a few minutes telling us about Moscow X, because I know I've been looking forward to this for a long, long time, even though I know I have, we were talking earlier, I'm working my way through a couple other books right now, and I have not read this whole thing in the less than 7 days since it was released. But yeah, brother, tell us about Moscow X.
I really thought you were going to clear your calendar last week to read that, Dell. I'm
I
extremely offended.
I'm a terrible person. Get a number, stand in line.
Yeah, get a number, stand in line. I will. So this book, I should say, as we were talking about Damascus Station, you don't need to read Damascus Station to enjoy Moscow X, in my opinion. The two books live in the same universe, and there is a main character that overlaps, but it's not a continuation of the Damascus Station story. So I just say that up front. And with Moscow X, what I became really interested in this question of what it might look like if the agency got very serious about taking the gloves off in its fight against Vladimir Putin and the Russians. And so the title of the novel, Moscow X, is basically a fictional component of the CIA's actual Russia house, run by this very colorful and deranged Artemis Proctor, who ends up in the penalty box, as we noted, and who comes up with a plan to make, as chief of Moscow X, to make Putin believe that a coup is underway when one is in fact not. So to do that, she enlists the help of a couple CIA case officers who are knocks, right? They're under non-official cover, fairly exotic forms of cover. One is a lawyer. Her name's Sia Fox. She's a London-based lawyer. Another one is named Max Castillo. He is a thoroughbred horse breeder and dealer from northern Mexico, and they get paired up as part of Proctor's operation. They get in front of one of Putin's money men. His name's Vadim, fairly despicable character, St. Petersburg-based banker, who is also running a piece of Putin's financial empire, which is a thoroughbred operation outside of St. Petersburg. And Vadim is married to a woman named Anna, who is a banker as well, but unbeknownst to CIA, is an SVR knock, and SVR being the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. Yeah. And so there's this sort of dance between Anna and her husband and Proctor and the officers at Moscow X, bit of a cat and mouse game. And what we realize is that Anna she's a very singular and kind of resilient person, and she's really just kind of playing a game that's all her own. So the book is, I think hopefully an update on the tradecraft and sort of glimpse into the espionage business from Damascus Station, because that book took place more than a decade ago. This book is, present day Russia. But it's also really kind of an examination of vengeance and betrayal in the middle of the sort of shadow war between Washington and Moscow.
Awesome. I cannot wait to read it. The thought that popped into my head was, we waited not a relatively long time before Jason Matthews' Red Sparrow was released and the time it actually came out as a movie. Has there been any talk at all about turning either Damascus Station or Moscow X into a film?
So we sold the rights to Damascus Station to Lionsgate Entertainment like a month or two before the strike. So that development process has just been paused, right? We have Gideon Raff, who did Homeland and The Spy, attached. But again, development timeline, if and when, all that kind of stuff, I don't know, knock on wood. And the conversations on Moscow X will start here, hopefully, in the next few months. But it's kind of been with the strike and all that, we've just kind of been sitting back and saying, all right, we'll pick all this up when Hollywood starts moving again.
Oh, wow. Well, that's awesome, man. That would be fantastic that'd be fantastic to see. That would be very, very exciting. So here's something I would like to just to bend your ear on and hear what you think. Because I know there's folks out there within the firm I work for, as well as folks that watch these videos who are aspiring writers. They want to become writers. One of the things that has blown me away, having ventured into this world, and I'm not published yet, but it's just the way that people like you and, Jack Stewart and Connor Sullivan and Taylor Moore, you would think that you're coming into this room where, like you're the new kid at school and you're trying to find a place to sit in the cafeteria, and, all that's open is like, the varsity football team, but it's nothing like that at all. It's just this amazing, supportive community where people will help you and lift you up. And could you just talk a little bit about that? Did you have a similar experience, or was it just my charm that has allowed this to happen for me?
Well, you are very charming. I don't think that can't be denied here. No, that was absolutely and continues to be my experience. I generally, I'll just tell you how I think about it, and maybe I'm forcing my own conception of the world onto the writing community. There's certainly that risk here, but for me, writing, like every day, it's sort of this three-legged stool of fear, joy, and self-loathing, right? Like, and it's just a matter of how much of each am I going to get? What's the balance going to be? And I think that most writers, hopefully that would resonate with, but as a result, they would sort of understand like that it's been really helpful to them when they have had seasons where it's like, oh man, you're struggling to get a story done, you're struggling to get published, you're like dealing with imposter syndrome, whatever it might be, that there's somebody in that community who is maybe at that particular point in time experiencing enough joy in their little three-legged stool that they can kind of reach down or reach in and be like, hey, I'm going to help you because I know what that feels like. You know what I mean? And I think we all hopefully just actually love good stories and like to, make sure that those continue to get into the world. So I've generally found that, whatever pocket of kind of the writing community you're in, that there's hopefully enough people like that who are willing to be helpful, willing to read stuff, willing to talk you off a ledge, whatever it might be, willing to give you some encouragement when you're getting beat up, that we've all been there. And so we're sort of willing to help when someone else is experiencing the fear and self-loathing and you've got a little bit in your tank. You know what I mean? That's kind of how I look at it.
Oh, definitely. And what advice would you give to somebody who is, thinking about writing that novel? Because, of 100 people that say they're going to write a novel, one or two actually finish it. Of that small group of individuals, 1 out of 300 will actually get published.
Sure.
So it's daunting. It's like, saying you can want to go work for the CIA. It might happen, but it's not an easy path.
Yeah. I have a couple thoughts, and I'm always a little bit cautious of ever offering advice because everyone's sort of journey is unique to them. But I think this stuff applies. I mean, one is like, there's actually a significant amount of simplicity to this, which is you've got to sit down and actually put words on paper on a very consistent basis, probably every day or at least 4 or 5 days a week. You got to do that even when you don't feel inspired by the story. And you just have to almost look at it like you're punching a clock or you're going to the gym or something like that, where it's like in order to have the book, to have the story, you have to sweat through that stuff. And there's just there's no shortcut. So I always tell people, like, just start with 200 words a day, 100 words a day, whatever it might be, and just do that and just measure it by word count and make sure you're consistent, and set a rhythm that you can sustain. So there's that piece of it. I think, the other thing is like, you do have to read a lot, in my opinion, to be an effective writer, because you learn a lot and you also understand sort of the genre conversation that's going on around you. So you got to read a ton. And I always would also just encourage people to never put the commercial stuff first, and to not really, I wouldn't worry about or think about getting published until you get the story done. Yeah, I get the story done, and get yourself to the point where you feel like the story is in good shape before you kind of go down that commercial road. And that comes out of my opinion that in general, you want to write something that's true to your own voice. And that means writing first and foremost kind of for your own nightstand. Like, I think the best, in my opinion, the best stories are coming out of somebody, because that's the kind of book that they would want to read.
Yeah.
And if you get too focused on the commercial side of things, or how do I get an agent, or how do I get published, like, you're gonna, I think, distract yourself at best from the story and the writing, and at worst, maybe bastardize it, because you start to let other things filter in, as opposed to like discovering the story that you need to discover.
Cool. Well, I've got two more questions for you. And I would, one of which would be, and I would be remiss without bringing this up, especially from a former analyst and somebody who's just published a book that I absolutely know is going to be amazing. And it has to do with the Russians. How do you see the situation in Ukraine playing out?
I said I just wanted easy questions on this for this conversation, Dell. Oh man, I mean, I think long bloody slog. It doesn't. I don't know how it could be any other way. I don't quite know how to even think about what a sort of political outcome looks like where this thing, quote unquote, ends. But it seems like we're now at a point where, and anything could happen, I guess, but where the most likely outcomes don't include, a collapse of the Russian military, or the collapse of the Russian state, or, a massive and sort of overwhelming military victory that happens relatively quickly for either side. Like, those don't seem like the most likely scenarios. So we seem to be in a situation where, it's not that things aren't changing. Of course, like the battlefield is not, it's not, stable, right? I mean, the lines shift and move slowly, and there's a whole bunch going on in terms of supply chains and morale and things like that could affect the outcome, on the battlefield. But like, and it's hard for me to imagine this thing ending anytime soon. And It just kind of seems like, long bloody slog, which is, unfortunate, of course, and tragic, but, at the same time, other outcomes like, Ukraine being turned into a vassal state, subsumed by Russia, colonized by Russia, bits and pieces of it hacked away by the Russians, seem pretty lousy too. So I don't know. I hope the Ukrainians win. Let me put it that way.
No, absolutely. And I think one of the reasons why I wanted to ask that question from your perspective is there is no short-term solution for this. This is gonna continue to go on for quite a while. It'll be 2 years in February. I don't see an end to it.
Crazy, huh? That's crazy.
Yeah. All right. So one last question, and I swear this one will be easy, because this is what I've been trying to ask. Whenever we get a former agency officer in here, especially an individual who's writing espionage. Who is your favorite Bond? There are no wrong answers. There are answers that are more right than others.
That's true. I mean, look, I I feel like Sean Connery might be one of the more correct answers. I will say, having largely grown up with the Daniel Craig version of Bond, that I'd probably pick him. I have enjoyed nearly all those movies immensely and think he's done a wonderful job with the role. I'm going to say Daniel Craig. I don't know how wrong of an answer. I don't know what end of the spectrum that's on, but I'm going to
honestly,
say
that
Craig.
is literally the best. That is the best answer one could possibly get. And I'm totally with you, because he was the Bond during my era.
Thanks for tuning in. If you found this content to be useful and entertaining, do us a favor and hit the like button. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. You can stay up to date with new episodes that we post every week. See you in the next episode.